welcome to episode 18 of the Stay Connected podcast. Today we are joined by Dr. Stuart McErlain-Naylor. Stuart has a PhD in computer simulation of sports biomechanics, is currently a lecturer in sports and exercise biomechanics at Loughborough University in the UK. He's also published over 30 research articles in the past decade. Hello, how are you doing today?
Hi, Chase. Yeah, good. Thanks. Great to be here, and yeah, great job on the pronunciations as well.
Yeah, we're trying to get in different styles of names, especially in the UK. I know things are pronounced differently sometimes, but I wanted to start off by asking you about what drew you towards researching the subject. Obviously, it's a little bit of a niche area of research. What kind of attracted you to it during your time in undergrad or in master's, getting your master's degree?
Yeah, I think even taking a step further back than that, I think at school or as a child, I was always, like a lot of us, really passionate about sport, whatever sport it was, passionate about playing, watching, officiating, whatever. I was good at maths and physics, but didn't really enjoy them. I always remember, I think I'd have been 16 to 18 somewhere. In the UK, we call them A-levels, but speaking to my A-level maths teacher in our mechanics class and basically saying, I'm never going to need to know any of this stuff. Why am I learning mechanics? I'm never going to use mechanics in my life. It's a waste of my time. Then kind of basically fast forward a few years from there, I'd gone to study sport and exercise science at Loughborough University, where I am back again now. I was kind of in a biomechanics class, sat in a seminar, and I suddenly realized I was doing the exact same question that had triggered my rant at the teacher a few years before, but just instead of some car pulling a trailer up a hill, it was a cyclist in the Tour de France, kind of, what power, what wattage do they need to win the race kind of questions. And that's probably a really good example, I think, of where it's something biomechanics that we often do in maths or physics when we're younger. A lot of people struggle to kind of access it or get passionate about it. Whereas then in sports science, it's really taking that same scientific knowledge and background, but actually applying it to things that we're really interested in. So that was my journey really in how I ended up getting into biomechanics as a field. My PhD was really quite theoretical. As you mentioned, it was all around computer simulation and basically building a computer model of how force is transmitted through the body after an impact. Whereas the National Cricket Performance Centre is on campus at our university. I had friends that were studying for their PhDs at the same time who were doing PhDs part funded by the England and Wales Cricket Board. They were researching cricket bowling, cricket batting, various aspects related to cricket. I kind of got involved in helping them out with those things. In particular, which I think is what we'll probably end up talking about today, one of them was around cricket batting. So a good friend called Chris Peplow, who finished his PhD, then moved on into industry, whereas I stayed in academia, picked up a lot of those data sets, collected more data and added to it afterwards, and kind of took that idea of cricket batting biomechanics and started to run with it a bit more. So the other thing I always point out is I'm definitely a biomechanist that has had to learn cricket through getting involved in some of these projects, rather than often you get someone who knows the sport inside out and then has to learn the science to apply to it. I've definitely been the other way around, but I think maybe quite important for our conversation around what can baseball or other sports learn from cricket. I think it's been quite useful at times being an outsider where you're not necessarily coming in with, this is how things have always been done. This is how I was taught when I was a youngster, first learning the sport. It's actually just, well, from a scientific perspective, from a mechanical perspective, what does and doesn't make sense. Yeah, I guess that's a bit of a background, a long, waffly background, but at the end of all that, I've been involved in doing some research into the biomechanics of cricket batting.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's similar to a lot of stories for people that I hear. In sports, specifically baseball, obviously is a very well explored sport from a biomechanical standpoint and also a statistical standpoint, but there's a lot of people that don't come from a more traditional background, maybe as a player in university or as a professional. And I think, as you said, there's a lot of value to having those perspectives, and even why you, as someone who hasn't done much research in baseball, we want you on this podcast because sometimes there's a lot of good ideas that we could take from other sports, and there's also good ideas that people in other sports can have about baseball without having as deep of a knowledge, some like innocence of asking questions that we might bat away because of our preconceived notions. So you talked about being at the National Cricket Center. Was at your campus. So I wanted to dive in a little bit to your research on cricket bat speed. I know you've published some papers and also done some seminars and talks on it, but kind of how that process went for you, and then also explain a little bit of the key factors you found in the generation of bat speed among cricket players.
Yeah, sure. So again, I'll probably try and start right at the beginning and give people a picture of what, you know, this testing environment would actually look like. So if people aren't familiar with biomechanics research, we basically use 3D motion capture, which is the same technology that's used for often computer games or animated movies. So I know, you know, in America you might not be as big as soccer fans, but games like FIFA for soccer is often done in this way, where you might see videos online of players wearing what typically looks like a black suit with some shiny reflective balls or markers on that suit, and then the infrared cameras are tracking those markers in order to track the movement of the players where they are at any one point. They then use that to kind of an animation over the top of it that says, put this animated person in the same positions that the player was in when they were in the lab, and we'll make it look realistic. So we know it actually looks like that person's technique or their goal celebration or whatever it is. Similarly, in films, I think Avatar was done in this way. There's some really good cases you can find online with the Polar Express, usually around Christmas time, where you've got actors covered in markers in a lab. Even, I think originally it was one of the Star Wars films, maybe Jar Jar Binks was one of the first characters that was fully done in this way. Basically, it's that kind of technology that people might have seen in other contexts. But instead of putting markers on clothing or kind of a black motion capture suit, because we want it to be scientifically very accurate rather than just looking the same, if you imagine that any clothing you're wearing might move on top of the skin, so it might move and not actually reflect what the bones underneath are doing, we typically stick the markers directly onto the skin. So really, you'd walk into our National Cricket Performance Centre, which is basically just an indoor cricket pitch or cricket field. We'd have around 18 of these infrared cameras up on big tripods around the players. Because it's batting rather than bowling or pitching, we typically have nets up, so the player would be inside nets just so they can't smash a ball at the expense of cameras and cause a load of damage. But basically, we're putting them in some kind of situation, giving them some kind of batting performance-related task, and we're just tracking their body or their bat or the ball, whatever we're interested in, during that movement, at which point we then statistically analyze it to answer questions like, what technique factors predict a faster bat speed, or what are the differences in technique between England internationals and local club players, or between male and female elite players, or those kind of questions. So then in terms of those answers, again, I like to try and simplify things as much as possible, or try and come at it from a very mechanical perspective of A causes B, which causes C, which causes D, and let's actually test and quantify each of those steps rather than just assuming we know something when we might not. So normally I draw a diagram with the thing we're interested in at the top and say, what things cause that? And then go, well, what things cause each of those? Well, what things cause each of those? And then eventually you get down to actual technique that can be coached or measured or kind of, you know, useful, hopefully in some way to players or coaches, rather than, and that's the other general principle, is wherever you end up, we want it to be something that's meaningful to players and coaches, not just, you know, some scientific terminology or some measurement that involves, you know, the inflow of energy into a particular segment that if you tell a player to increase or decrease it, they won't have a clue what you're talking about. So really for us, step one was, what is our actual outcome? What's the thing we want to actually get better or worse at? Which is actually a lot harder than it sounds for batting. In cricket, but I imagine similarly in baseball. For pitching or bowling, you might just say, let's maximize ball speed. Throw the ball as fast as possible. We've got one number. If that number's higher, we've done something good. If that number goes down, we've done something bad. Whereas then especially in cricket, when you look at batting, we could show elite players or elite coaches 10 shots by 10 different players or 10 shots by the same player, and they might all disagree about which one the best shot was. So it then gets really hard to put a number on it and decide what we're trying to maximize or minimize. Really, we simplified that by ignoring 99% of what cricket batters do and just focusing on the occasion where they're trying to hit the ball as far as possible. So the equivalent of a home run in cricket, if you can clear the boundary, so the edge of the field, without the ball bouncing, you get 6 runs, i.e. 6 points, basically, which is the maximum score that you can get. So we ignored all of the tactical kind of shots in between fielders or defensive shots and just said, if you're trying to hit the ball as far as possible to maximize the number of runs or points you can get, how do you do that? So at the top of our diagram, we've got ball distance. When you take a step back from that, anyone that's done mechanics or maths at school might remember that the distance something travels is dictated by the speed it's going at and the angle that it goes at. So there really are 2 things. If we want to change where the ball lands, we can either launch the ball off of the bat faster so that it will go further, or we can launch it at a better angle. The angle side of the diagram is a bit boring in that basically, well, it can get a bit more interesting, but in simple terms, changing the angle of your bat will change the angle that the ball then goes at. There are some interesting things, like we've observed elite players typically hit the ball at a much flatter angle than what is theoretically optimum, which then comes into loads of questions around, well, why is that? Is it because they don't want to risk getting caught? Is it because they can actually swing the bat faster at that angle than other angles? But on the other side of that diagram, when we start to go, what is it that enables you to hit the ball fast? It's obviously related to bat speed, but the other key factor is the impact location on the bat face. So as is probably also the case in baseball, you've got a sweet spot on the bat. Really, it's how fast can you swing the bat, and then can you actually get an impact in the sweet spot of that bat, which we did a load of work trying to quantify. Well, how big is that sweet spot? What is the impact of hitting it slightly off center, both in terms of speed and direction that the ball goes in, so we can then control for that in some of the other things we did. But where I think it gets more interesting is that question of, well, how do you actually swing the bat fast so that you can then hit the ball fast so that the ball can then go far? And that's when we get into technique and the bit that I think you're probably interested in asking about when you pose the question. And there, really, if we ignore, again, most of the results of our research, we found 3 key factors in their technique that are associated with the speed at which they can swing a bat. And that was in a sample of players ranging from local club players, so some of my friends were the research participants, through to senior England internationals, and basically trying to say, what is it along that spectrum of players in their technique that explains the differences in bat speed that they're able to generate? And 3 key things came out. So in order of priority, I guess, the number one thing that explained the biggest amount of variation between players was something called X factor, which is a term, speaking of learning from other sports, that's a term that came from golf research. But again, if you imagine drawing a line through your shoulders from left shoulder to right shoulder, a line through your hips from left hip to right hip, if you're just standing upright, if someone's looking a bird's eye view from above, those 2 lines are going to be on top of each other. There's no separation. If you kind of start your backswing, those 2 lines will start to rotate as your hips and shoulders rotate. X factor is about how much those 2 lines can separate and create an X rather than being on top of each other. So if you rotate your hips and shoulders the same amount, the lines will stay on top of each other. Whereas if you can leave your hips behind a bit and rotate your shoulders even further than your hips, they start to separate and you get this X. So basically, the bigger that X, the more players could separate their hips and shoulders during the backswing, the more they were then later on able to generate faster bat speeds. So that was our number one factor. The second one was the amount of extension in their lead or front elbow during the downswing of the bat. So again, the faster players there are extending their elbow and they're contacting the ball with a pretty extended or straight arm, whereas some of the lesser skilled players were maintaining a flexed elbow throughout, or were even sometimes flexing their elbow instead of extending it during the downswing. And then finally, the third bit was something we called wrist uncocking. It was basically the motion of the wrist at the end of that swing. So they were actually using their wrist to add on to what had already come from further down the chain. And where that, as a final point, I find interesting about that is that the order of importance starts with the things in the middle of the body and then goes out to the elbow and then the wrist. We're basically saying that a successful batting shot, trying to swing the bat as fast as possible, involves that entire chain of the body, not just one part of it, but that the better players were able to better use the central parts of their body, i.e. their hip and shoulder separation, which then followed through to the elbow, followed through to the wrist, and they did all of them more, but the central parts were the most important.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. There's a lot of parallels to some of the research done by places like Driveline, or even some of the practice that we implement here with connected performance towards velocity and speed training. As in baseball, they say adapt or die. And so understanding the kinematic sequence and hacking the chain, they say sometimes, to get people to swing faster, especially in batting, has become a really, really popular topic over here in the States recently. But there's another piece of research that you did that looked into the differences in strategy between men and women. And it seemed to me that the strategy of women was a little more based on a traditional technical model. And it was just kind of interesting to see how their swings differed, even if the outcome that they were shooting for was similar ultimately. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I think the context here that listeners may or may not be aware of is probably the evolution of cricket as a sport over recent years, in that historically the primary form of the game has been multiple day, kind of 5-day matches where you don't have that time demand or that time pressure. It's mostly not getting out is almost the biggest priority, so that you can stay in for as long as possible and score as many runs. Whereas in recent years, 1-day formats of the game through to kind of 20 over, where an over is 6 deliveries, through to even now 100 ball versions of the game have started to develop more and more, and are now becoming, especially financially, probably the biggest forms of the game. So historically, there wasn't that emphasis on kind of risk reward, trying to get as many runs as quickly as possible. Whereas now, in these newer formats of the game, there's an increasing focus on that. So when we say that the female players we've observed were using more of a kind of traditional technical model, basically they're playing in a way what we would call more of a checked drive, where they're playing in a way that's traditional of a cricket shot, whereas often the male players had developed a specific technique just for this power hitting task or scenario, which often, as far as I'm aware, has involved lots of working with baseball coaches, golf coaches, etc., to look at what's done in other sports. But where it gets interesting for me is the idea of whether the female players even should be trying to bat in the same way as the male players, or whether they just have a different best way of batting. And we don't necessarily have answers for that yet, but it's really interesting to think about factors that differ between the two sports. It's not just, the individual holding the bat that's different. Female cricket has a different size and weight of ball coming towards them that's bowled at a different speed, different levels of spin. They're holding a bat that is a different size and a different weight. The fielders they're trying to get it past will have different speed characteristics. Even the boundary that they have to clear, so the size of the field, is different. And when you put all of those factors in, it's almost an entirely different task. And even when you factor in, body characteristics of height, weight, limb length, strength, all of those things that might be different between the players, coaching history, financial resources, and all of these interrelate. So for example, the moment a coach coaches a female player differently because of either real differences in any of those things, or the coach's perceived differences in any of those things, you can no longer separate what's due to differences in those things and what's due to the coaching that they've had, because the coaching that they've had is caused by the differences in those things and vice versa. So it's just really interesting to think of it from the perspective, me at least, of there not necessarily being one optimum way that everyone should play, that we should coach, but saying everyone can potentially explore the solutions that are available to them and find their own way of batting. And when you then apply that into coaching, even within a cohort of just male or just female players, It's saying, well, can we facilitate their own exploration of different ways of playing rather than telling them what to do? Can we just either put them in different situations and let them figure it out for themselves? Or can we give some kind of feedback that enables them to get really quick ideas of what is and isn't working, so that when they do try different things, speed up that process of trying things out for themselves?
Going off that, Stuart, I got a question, just because I think that the American baseball world, the general principles of like motor learning and setting up environments and different constraints and just having like a goal-oriented approach of learning, rather than like the coach just vomiting on the athlete of like, hey, do this, like, hey, create this bigger X, is like a large way that baseball coaches have done things for so long. And I don't know if that's just the selection bias of like the best athletes in the world, like your best baseball players, like they might legitimately just be talented enough to do that with their body, but the general person is really not. So that's why the elite are the elite and the regular Joe is the regular Joe. But this idea is starting to trickle in a lot more in certain organizations and certain training facilities, or even with just certain coaches in maybe bad environments. But how do, for you being the researcher, what is the system in place for you to communicate to a coach, hey, this is what's going on? How do you then make changes, I guess? What's the system in place over there to actually take the research and take the principles of learning and then actually create change?
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question. But I think in some ways it's how the research is set up in the first place, given that a lot of our cricket research has been funded or part funded by England and Wales Cricket Board. So they're almost involved from the outset. We've got other projects kind of part funded by the NFL or UK athletics, etc. So it's kind of working with those bodies from the outset. But I think once we actually get the research findings, this is something I'm really passionate about, is the actual communication. And I guess today's an example of that, but the actual communication of those findings in a way that isn't just writing it down in scientific journal articles, but trying to translate that to the people that are actually interested in it. But even then, necessary separation, I think, between mechanical principles, other things, for want of a better word, where some of the things we're investigating are, general mechanical principles that will apply to any person, any activity. Other things are maybe a bit more individual specific or differ between people. And I think one of the key tasks for us that we don't always do very well is to distinguish between those two and try and work out what is a key mechanical principle that applies to everybody and what is individual specific. But that's a bit of a cop-out, cheat conclusion to say, oh, everyone's different. My follow-up question is then always, well, why is everyone different? Is it the taller players do this and the shorter players do that, or the stronger players do this and the weaker players do that? Unless you can say that bit, just saying everyone's different is kind of pointless. But even if it is those mechanical key principles that apply to everybody, there still could be a limit to, yes, the more you do this, the faster the bat will go. But then you've got to be able to control that. It's like an example I often use of the long jump run up in track and field athletics, which is similar to bowling in cricket, where across a group of players, the people that run up faster will bowl the ball faster or jump further. Or you can, on average, say the faster you run up, then the further you'll jump or the faster you'll throw the ball. However, that doesn't mean that any individual person within that study is running up or should be running up at 100% of their maximum speed. It doesn't mean, for a long jump or a cricket bowling action, I should just sprint flat out and then try and throw the ball or jump at the end of it, because I won't be able to control that. So I think, again, it's trying to distinguish between group level findings and then an individual. If you took one individual and got them to run up at 10 different speeds, what speed would be best for them? It might, I don't know, I haven't done this, but it might be, 70, 80, 90% of their maximum. But if everyone runs up at 90% of their maximum, the ones who have a higher 90% will do better. So it's trying to distinguish, I think, between those things. The other thought that came to mind, I think, is around creating environments that enable people to explore those things. So the X factor might be a tricky one to put a concrete example on here, but if there's a fundamental mechanical principle that we think players should do this and they will improve, there's still a difference between, as you say, telling them that they have to do that versus putting them in a situation or applying some kind of constraint to their practice that encourages them to explore that and then figure out their own way of doing it or their own technique. Or if they're locked into a certain way of doing something that we think there might be a better alternative, is there anything we can do that almost removes the option of them playing in that way so that they then are forced to explore other options? So we're still kind of allowing them to find their own solution that works for them over time, but we're kind of focusing in their search a bit into certain areas of techniques that we think would be beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we talk a lot on this podcast about the importance of representative practice, whether it's baseball backspin fungo, or maybe dry work on the mound, or hitting off of a tee. And obviously, cricket is a batting sport as well, where there's an interaction between the bowler and the batter in this situation. And in the past, I feel like cricket has given baseball a lot of inspiration because there seems to be more research around this interaction than there is in baseball, at least that's publicly available, just because a lot of the stuff in baseball is behind basically behind the team paywall, for lack of a better term. But in 2020, published research around the effect of the delivery method in cricket batting on upper body kinematics. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because kind of as Ben mentioned, as you just mentioned, we know that the environment that an athlete is in is going to influence the way that they perform, and it's going to be a subconscious action. It's going to emerge from all the task, environmental, individual constraints that are present, along with obviously social cultural constraints, and as you said, maybe effects from past coaching. But could you talk a little bit about that study and kind of what you found between those different environments for cricket batters?
Sure. Yeah, and I think this is getting into that idea, or maybe a key thing to understand again here for some background context. Fast bowlers, or particularly fast bowlers in cricket, are very injury prone. So the lumbar stress fracture, so a stress fracture in the lumbar spine, is a very prevalent injury within that population that requires really careful training load management, which means if we're coaching batters, we can't necessarily have fast bowlers running up and bowling at them all session long because of having to manage the loads of those bowlers. So it then becomes really important. Well, it is used a lot to say, well, what other alternatives can we use? But the question then is, what effect are these having on the technique that batters develop? Or are they, as you say, are they actually representative of what they should be doing? And I think the key point here, before we get into any specifics, I think, is what needs to be representative, because it's often thought in a quite simplistic way that the more realistic the kind of practice, the better, down to, this is a ridiculous example, but, is the bowler wearing the same color t-shirt that they'd be wearing in a match? Like that kind of, but is it in the correct environment? Are they running in the same way? Are the fielders in the same place? Is the boundary, whatever, is there a match kind of context to whether they're winning or losing? Let's try and make everything as specific as we possibly can, which is all very good and very important. But it's in this context, I think it's important to think about which of those aspects have to be representative. You can have a lab-based study or a study wearing VR glasses or some other abstract scenario that is very representative training design if the thing that you actually want to train is representative. So in our case, really here, it's what visual information are they using to inform their technique and inform their selection of what shots to play and how to then time and play those shots. And is that information the same, or are they making the same decisions that they would be making? And if everything else is completely different, but they're taking in the correct information and making the correct decisions off the back of it, we're happy. It's kind of exploring that really, where we had actual real life human bowlers as our first condition. We then had a bowling machine. So I'm not sure exactly what the options are in baseball, but in cricket, the simplistic version is just a big machine that with no cue or no real warning other than hearing a noise as it's about to happen, a ball just fires out of a hole towards you at a very consistent kind of speed, spin, and location, depending how you've set it up. We then had this intermediate kind of compromised scenario, which is often used by coaches, to be fair, where a coach was holding, I think it's called a sidearm thrower, but it's, if you've ever seen people in the park throwing a ball to their dog, holding a big plastic thing with a cup on the end that the ball sits in, they kind of fling the plastic thing and the ball flies really far out the end of it. It's basically coaches using that to throw the ball down in a similar way to the bowling action, but to add more speed onto it and to be able to do it kind of repetitively rather than having to have a full run up over and over again. So we compared those three conditions. The bits that are important for this discussion, I think, are to think about how much visual information is available. So with the bowler, you can see everything you would see from a real bowler because it is a real bowler. From the bowling machine, you can assume you're getting zero visual information to keep it simple. Whereas with the sidearm thrower or dog thrower, you're getting somewhere in the middle, where you are getting some visual information of the coach's arm and you can kind of guess when it's going to come out or how they're throwing it, but it's not the same and it might not be representative of the actual cues you'd be getting in a match. And then if we skip just back to the early discussion on what three things predict bat speed, we found just with those three, some slight differences in how they were measured and defined, but the central rotations of the body were biggest against a bowler. The elbow seemed to be biggest against the sidearm thrower, and then the wrist seemed to be most dominant against a bowling machine. So again, when you think back to that, we'd call it proximal to distal, but that sequence starting in the center of the body and then working outwards. The central rotations were able to be used most against a bowler, whereas then as you removed more and more visual information, it was starting to get more and more dominated by segments or joints further down that chain, which in a simplistic way of looking at it, because I always try and find a simple story rather than overcomplicating things, it's almost suggesting that the more you remove the visual information, the later they're able to pick up on things, the later they're having to make decisions. And so they're unable to fully use those early central movements. And it is becoming more a case of throwing their arms at it or throwing the bat at it instead of a fully coordinated chain through the body. So if anyone's interested in kind of trying to dig it out and read it, the actual results are a bit more complicated than that. But I think it illustrates that there is this relationship between what visual information we get, technique we then use, and then also thinking about what we were aiming to coach, because again, it's not necessarily always good or always bad. There could be some things in which a bowling machine is great for coaching that aspect of technique, as long as you're aware and keeping an eye on a check that you're not also introducing any unintended consequences elsewhere in the movement. And even in that study, we looked at a kind of more attacking and a more defensive shot, or two different types of shot. And you do get differences between the two, where a bowling machine might be better at one than another, even kind of depending how much time they've got to make decisions, whether that is a limiting factor, etc. So again, it's not always black and white, but it's that big why question of, well, why are we doing that? Why do we think it's a good thing or a bad thing? And just trying to almost chase those arrows along the diagram of, well, we're doing that because it will then affect this thing, which we know is linked to this outcome, which is the thing we're trying to improve, and just keeping an eye on any other things to make sure there are no unintended consequences elsewhere.
I've got to actually, going back, Stuart, to like an earlier point, I heard you mention something about lumbar disc fractures with bowlers, correct? I was wondering if you had done any research at all or noticed anything in terms of these fractures coming up with certain styles of bowlers. I've looked at a little bit of Stephen Jones's stuff. I guess a lot of it, but I don't want to butcher it here and say I know what I'm talking about. But I know he would talk about like two different styles of quick bowlers, like guys who essentially throw, for all Americans, like guys who throw for speed, like they get guys out by throwing fast. But he would have one style, I think he would almost call like a slinger. And they create a ton of lateral flexion of their spine to almost create room to bring the arm through over the top. And I was just wondering if you had seen anything specific or correlative at all with like degrees of lateral flexion and lumbar spine issues, or like arm slot, or where they're releasing the ball and lumbar issues. I think It's something maybe subjectively I've noticed, but if you look at in baseball, there's guys who will throw over the top by using lateral flexion of the trunk. They'll create this rising effect of the ball almost because of the backspin on it from a higher slot. Something I think I've noticed is if these guys have a lower back injury at some point in their career, you'll notice when they hit, I don't know, maybe 30 or 31, you can see their throwing mechanics start to change and they're not as effective, I think. They don't throw as hard. They're not able to be as deceptive. And it likely could be due to age. It could be due to the fact that their spine can't get in the same positions. But I was just wondering, going back on the lumbar disc issue, if you had noticed anything there.
Yeah, it's definitely been done, not through, well, people I know very well, but not something I've been involved in, given that I've mostly focused on the batting side of things. But I do have a good friend called Pete Allway, who is now, I believe his title is something like research manager for England cricket. His PhD was on exactly that, and he's published a lot of good research on it. So might be someone good to talk to. But I know with their work, kind of the things I do know are that we don't believe it's due to the impact with the ground. So it's kind of traditionally believed, especially because in cricket, they're running up before bowling and they're bowling very fast, running up very fast. They're kind of running up, slamming their front foot into the ground, and then almost locking out that front leg as the rest of their body rotates over it. And it's kind of converting that linear momentum from the run up into then an angular momentum of the body rotating over it, the arm coming over and then releasing. It was traditionally thought that that big impact with the ground, and there are some really big impact forces, was the thing causing these injuries. Whereas we then know from research in loads of different sports, the forces on bone are much more to do with the muscles pulling on those bones than the impact getting up from the ground. Even if you think about things like shin splints in endurance runners, so an impact or a location on the body that's much closer to the ground, the force on the tibia, so your shin bone, is much more a result of the muscles pulling on that bone than the force from the ground. And that's for something at the shin. By the time you get up to the lumbar spine, got some research at the moment we're working on where we've put accelerometers at different points on the body, and we're looking at kind of trying to measure the acceleration and showing that really by the time it gets to the base of the spine, almost everything from that initial impact gone already through, flexion of joints, compression of joints, things like your muscle and fat wobbling around when you hit the ground. All of those things act to kind of dissipate that impact so that not actually that much of it, still some, but not that much is reaching the lumbar spine compared to the muscles pulling on it. And it is a very big rotational movement at that lumbar spine, which will result in a lot of muscle force. The work I was talking about by Pete Allway and colleagues, I know they've tried to basically predict prospective, so future injury history, fast bowlers based on their technique. So they'll do everything we described with batters and the reflective markers with fast bowlers. They measure everything about their technique, follow them up for, I believe it's 2 years afterwards, and see who did and who didn't get an injury and try and work out what the differences are between those two groups. Can you predict at baseline whether or not someone will get an injury? And on the surface of it, it sounds very successful in that I believe, because I was looking at it the other day, they predicted something like 88% of players successfully based on nothing other than their technique. So no workload information, no speed, force information or anything else, just their technique. But then the other thing to consider is that this injury is so prevalent that around 75% of the bowlers actually got injured. So if I just grabbed a bit of paper and wrote yes on it and just showed that to every single player, I'd have predicted 75% of the yes or no injuries successfully. So I think they basically predicted all but one of the injuries successfully, whereas they then had about a 55% success rate at predicting the people that wouldn't get injured. And I know you're there in your head going, well, tell us what it is. Tell us the technique bits that predicted it. And that's the bit where I draw a blank, given that it wasn't actually my research. But I know they've pulled out key technique factors, both at back foot contact, which is the impact with the ground before the one when they then release the ball, and at front foot contact, which is just before ball release. And there are technique factors involved at both of those phases that link into injury risk. And I believe it's quite, even the front foot contact, so that second phase mechanics, are very closely related to what happens early on. So it does seem that for the cricket bowlers, it's the technique towards the end of the run-up that is then causing them to have to compensate for that in some way later on. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't recall kind of specific details of exactly what they measured that could predict things. But if anyone's interested, if you look up Pete Alway, so always with the S removed, you'll find the researcher. I know he's done some online seminar videos for me as well that I think are on YouTube. So people can probably find that if they are interested in learning a bit more.
Yeah, I honestly, I feel like we could talk all day about some of this research. It's like cricket and baseball, I think, have such interesting parallels, and also just some of the topics that you've done specific research on, I think, are just have so many layers, and we can keep pulling them back. But don't want to keep you too long, so I'll finish up with asking about what you're excited to dive into in 2024, and then also where we can find you and your research online.
Great question. What am I excited about? I think for me personally, and probably what I'm excited about for the field of biomechanics anyway, and that's why I'm doing it personally. Most of my research now is about trying to take the biomechanics lab out into the real world. So everything I've described so far, other than maybe that accelerometer bit at the end, involves motion capture cameras, force plates, lab environments, people coming in and being tested in that specific environment on one day. What I'm really passionate about is saying, can we use wearable technology, video and AI approaches to monitor people during their actual training session, their actual matches, to try and give the same level of analysis and feedback to players and coaches when it's actually useful and when they want it, but also at the same time to get more useful data. If you think of that injury study that we finished on, until you can track their technique during every actual delivery that they bowl, there are certain things you can never know for certain. You can never prove what's causing what. I think the idea of video or wearables moving the lab out into the real world and having actual real world impact with real people is a bit that I get really excited about. And then in terms of, I guess, finding out more, I agree there's loads that we could probably have the same conversation again with me just grilling you about things that I could learn from baseball. But I think if people are interested during lockdown on YouTube, so I've got a YouTube channel that's just my name very originally, but I hosted a sports biomechanics lecture series. I think it was 28 guest lectures on different sports by different people around the world. Following up from that, I also hosted a science in cricket series, or I can't remember how many there are, but there's a series of YouTube kind of scientific lectures on the science of cricket, almost all of which, if not all, would probably be very transferable to baseball, as long as we've discussed already, listeners come at it with that lens of, well, why? Don't just think that finding will automatically transfer to baseball, but it's thinking like, why is X factor associated with bat speed? Is that reason something that will also hold true in baseball? Or is that reason something that isn't true in baseball? And it's trying to make those decisions about what's the underlying thing and will that then transfer to baseball? So I think that's probably the main one. On social media, I'm Biomech Stu, so Biomech STU. But yeah, I think YouTube's probably the best one for having a dig around and trying to learn a bit more.
Awesome. Well, yeah, this was great. And as you said, I think we could go back and forth all day on different topics. But thank you for joining us today. And thank you everyone for tuning in to stay connected.
Thanks, Chase. Thanks, Ben.
All right, cool.